The big story on Times Now, and one that we broke first and has resonated across the country. No end to the war of words over the BBC documentary on Prime Minister Modi and his role in the 2002 Gujarat riots. Earlier today, the US State Department spokesperson was questioned by a Pakistani journalist on the BBC documentary when the US snubbed any reference to the documentary and hailed India's shared values with the US. Remember, this also comes days after the UK Prime Minister rejected any motivated attempt to discredit India on the basis of the documentary.
Does the Prime Minister agree with his diplomats in the Foreign Office that Modi was directly responsible, and just what more does the Foreign Office know of his involvement in this grave act of ethnic cleansing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the UK government's position on this has been clear and long-standing and hasn't changed. Of course, we don't tolerate persecution where it appears anywhere, but I'm not sure I agree at all with the characterisation that the honourable gentleman has put forward.
I'm not aware of this documentary that you point to, but what I will say broadly is that there are a number of elements that undergird the global strategic partnership that we have with our Indian partners. There are close political ties, there are economic ties, there are exceptionally deep people-to-people ties between the United States and India. But one of those additional elements are the values that we share, the values that are common to American democracy and to Indian democracy. India, of course, is the world's largest democracy. It's a vibrant democracy. And again, we look to everything that ties us together, and we look to reinforce all of those elements that tie us.
However, as India's allies dismiss the BBC documentary, there are some within our own country who are just as ready as the BBC to disregard the ruling of the Supreme Court in what appears to be an attempt to discredit the Prime Minister. Screenings were held in Hyderabad and Thiruvananthapuram and were also planned at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in the national capital. Now, the BJP has mounted massive protests in Thiruvananthapuram over the screening of the film by Kerala Youth Congress at Manniviyam Square. Times Now tracked all the action on the ground. Listen in to how there were protests by the BJP, by the ABVP against the screening of the banned film.
As you can see behind me, that the police is using water cannons to disperse the BJP activists out here. Remember, the screening is happening just 20 meters away from this barricade, what you can see here. And you can see at least 200 to 250 BJP and Yuva Morcha and also Mahila Morcha activists right now behind me. It will also be interesting to note as what action will be taken against those people who have conducted the screening out here in various parts of Kerala. Congress and CPM believes that it is a right of the citizens of the state to ensure that they watches this documentary that has been aired by the BBC. You can see here that the protest is still going on by the opposition parties. Over here, it is the BJP and the Yuva Morcha who are protesting against the BBC documentary screening. However, the government has decided that they will be giving an outside a silent support as far as this documentary screening is concerned. In the coming days also, in all districts, the Congress has decided to hold the screening on the eve of Independence Day. In all districts, the minority cell of the Congress or the KPCC has decided to hold the screening of the BBC documentary.
All right, let me take this across to Tuhin A, spokesperson of the BJP, George Kurian, political analyst, and Anirban Banerjee, also political analyst. Let me first ask you, we also have Rishi Bagri, political analyst, with us. Tuhin A, questions are being asked of the government that if you believe in freedom of expression, why are you banning a film?
Good evening, Padmaja. Good evening to all the panelists and the viewers. Padmaja, this is a transformed India. One, we don't need validation from foreign powers. Two, we don't have the time or the patience to be dragged into a malified agenda which has been repeatedly vanquished by the top courts of the country. In fact, one of the last judgments was against the person who had been peddling this narrative, Teesta Setalvad, calling her bluff. So at this point of time, this BBC documentary very clearly had a threefold nefarious agenda. Number one was to stoke communal unrest. Number two was to, cast aspersions on our judicial system. And number three was to, spoil the Indo-UK relations, which is, at a brilliant juncture at this point of time. And potentially we could be signing FTA very soon. And also, let me point out over here, the target over here was not just Mr. Modi, but also Mr. Rishi Sunak. So given the complexity of the issue, I think if we are within our rights to block this propaganda, in fact, Indira Gandhi
to try and piggyback on this documentary, George Kurian.
Let me also remind you.
I mean, suddenly everyone is a free speech advocate. All the parties, all of them who have put activists in jail, jailed cartoonists, have applied the sedition law, suddenly are, you know, with alacrity are screening this documentary, George Kurian.
Well, Padmaja, the entire world knows about the truth about the Gujarat riots, not just India. And BJP is trying its level best. It's trying, making all attempts to ensure and change the narrative and, make it look like it's a colonial thing. Having said that, BJP today is their nervousness and frustration. It can be easily seen with the way, Information and Broadcasting Ministry has tried to put a ban on the publication on Twitter and most of the social media platforms. I want to say that this documentary is based on an official report of the
It just seems to be that this documentary is pretty much the only weapon you have left in your arsenal. That somehow you want to revise the ghosts of 2002 in any which way.
Well, not really. You cannot corner the Congress party with regards to the documentary which is made by BBC. The Congress party doesn't have any hand in that.
No, you do actually, because the NSUI has said that we are going to screen it everywhere. You want to screen something?
Why not? If there is any documentary, see, BBC is a renowned media house, and we want to see what the truth is behind.
How do you decide that it's the truth? How do you decide what's in the documentary is the truth?
If the Bharatiya Janata Party,
sir, if you're such free speech advocates, you go and distribute copies of satanic verses. Your party was the one which had a problem with the red sari. Your party was the one which even had Andhi censored. And now suddenly you are like, documentary is about free speech. How do you know it's about the truth?
Well, unless you watch the documentary, you cannot come to a conclusion at this point in time. All I want to put it across to your viewers and audience is that BJP, if they feel that there is no substance to the documentary, why is there so much of fear and frustration that...
Why is there so much fear, Rishi Bhatt? Why is there so much fear?
No, I just, Padmaja, thanks. The BBC documentary is a gross interference in the internal affairs. Actually, if you see, it casts actually a serious aspiration on the Indian judiciary. It is an attack on the Indian democracy, and it is an attack on the independent judiciary also, which has actually given a clean check to the PM Modi on 2002 riots. And it is after a complete 8-year, 9-year, 10-year investigation, which was done under the UPA government, which was done under the Congress government. All these things happened. I mean, I don't understand why Congress under Rahul Gandhi keeps flogging a dead horse, which is the 2002 riots, and the outcome will be jail. I mean, his mother actually flogged the same horse between 2002 and 2014, and the results were in front of you.
Okay, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you, gentlemen, because you have yet another UK member of parliament who has spoken up against the documentary. Joining us live right now is Bob Blackman. Thank you very much, sir. What's your take on this controversy on Prime Minister Modi and that documentary released by the BBC?
I think it's an absolute disgrace that the BBC have literally be in a position whereby we've had episode 1 actually broadcast in the UK, and later this evening in the United Kingdom, episode 2 is due to be broadcast. I have to say I don't know the content of the second episode, but if it's anything like the first episode, this was poorly researched, contained complete innuendo, and dismissed the evidence that exists. And the first thing, obviously, is there was a complete downplaying of what caused the Gujarat riots in the first place, which, of course, was the murder of Hindu pilgrims who were burnt to death on a train carriage, where the evidence was clear that fuel had been used and that the whole carriage had been doused with fuel and then set alight, that had caused the tensions in the first place. The second was a complete attack on Sri Narendra Modi, on suggesting that in somehow, shape or form, he was responsible for the anti-Muslim riots that followed. It also dispersed, and this is something that I find it really difficult to understand, it interspersed interviews and comments that Narendra Modi had made as Chief Minister, trying to calm the situation down. It cast doubt on India's Supreme Court and the investigation that they held with a huge report, I think 451 pages of report that completely exonerated Narendra Modi from any blame whatsoever, and indeed found that he'd attempted, quite rightly, to calm the situation, to protect the citizens of Gujarat. So, far from being a responsible broadcaster, the BBC has been the victim now of a propaganda video, effectively, with, I think, severe undercurrents of anti-India feeling, clearly anti-Narendra Modi feeling. And you have to ask the question, here we are, more than 20 years on from these events, and yet the BBC is still trotting these unsubstantiated slurs on the Prime Minister of India. It doesn't help UK-India relations one bit. You have to question why the BBC and indeed the programme makers got involved in putting together such a programme at this point in the political cycle. And to me, it's an absolute outrage that it's being broadcast on BBC TV.
It's interesting that you say that this is totally unsubstantiated and 20 years later it has been brought back from the grave, as it were. What do you think are the motivations, if any?
Well, clearly, one of the issues of concern that I have as a strong supporter of good UK-India relations and building the friendship that we've got between our two great countries is that this casts a slur on those relations. And of course, at a time when we've obviously signed cooperation agreements with our friends in India and indeed are busily negotiating a trade deal between the United Kingdom and India, this just demonstrates that there are some people, the enemies of India, are trying to prevent this much needed trade deal from going ahead. I don't know their motivation. It's quite clearly very destructive and disruptive. And frankly, I just wish that they would do a proper job in terms of research, actually demonstrating that the Indian courts, as we know, are based on the United Kingdom, the British legal system, and therefore completely independent. And when they have found that there is no evidence, then clearly we should be respecting that in the United Kingdom. My worry slightly, and we've got episode 2 of this so-called documentary to come, which is to me nothing more, frankly, than a broadcast on behalf of opponents of the Indian Prime Minister and a direct slur on his character. But no doubt we're going to be faced with further so-called allegations that are going to come in terms of how the Indian government has acted. This is not responsible journalism in any shape or form and should not be shown on British television. I know that in India, this propaganda has been barred from being broadcast on social media. I never believe in censorship, but I do believe that it's absolutely right that appropriate warnings are given that this is a propaganda video rather than a responsible piece of journalism.
But this particular documentary relies largely on the inquiry conducted by the British High Commission in 2002. It's been referred to as proof of, the involvement of Mr. Modi. What do you make of that?
Well, obviously there are several issues around this. First is we're going back to a time when there was a Labour government in the United Kingdom, and Jack Straw was the Foreign Secretary. There was obviously elements of that being concluded on a Foreign Office review. I have to say, I find it reprehensible. We are no longer, I mean, the United Kingdom is no longer a colonial power that is somehow ruling over our colonies to be investigating what goes on in a sovereign country. That to me is an interference that should not have been taking place, full stop. It's not our place to be doing so. Equally, we don't know who it was that carried out this review anyway, and what sort of credibility they had and what advice was being given. What we do know is, of course, that Jack Straw was under severe pressure in his constituency because of a very large Pakistani population that existed in his constituency at the time. So there is a question mark that should be posed, and that is, was this review carried out for the British government, or was it carried out for party political purposes? And if so, that seems to me to be an abuse of Foreign Office resources. But as I say, there are questions to be answered by what happened when the British government decided to undertake this secret review, and equally issued banning orders on Narendra Modi from being enabled to visit the United Kingdom. I would say, of course, that those were lifted when David Cameron became Prime Minister, and Narendra Modi was enabled to visit. And of course, we had a wonderful visit with the community right across the UK from Narendra Modi when he addressed Wembley Stadium and a huge crowd, and demonstrated for the Indian diaspora in the United Kingdom that the friendship between India and the United Kingdom is growing stronger and stronger.
So do you think then, sir, that given that next year we have our elections, the documentary could have been released, timed to the elections, perhaps to influence them?
Yeah, I do think there's a rationale from this. That obviously India is the biggest democracy in the world and will hold elections next year. I suspect that those behind this particular so-called documentary are aiming to destabilise the Indian government and indeed destabilise the whole election process and try somehow to resuscitate the opposition. That is a matter for Indian politics. And I can just imagine the scenario that would be created in the United Kingdom if India and the Indian government decided to hold a review of the political parties in the United Kingdom. I suspect that British people would not be happy. And so I say that it's not right for the UK, particularly in this respect, of interfering in the democratic process of India. And it seems as though that is the intention, and that is not something that we should be doing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bob Blackman, for speaking 2 times now. Very interesting perspective that you give us, that a lot of these decisions perhaps not entirely informed by a quest for justice, but perhaps very, very narrow politics in 2002. It's indeed quite amazing that the way it has been lapped up in India, irrespective of what the courts have said, what facts seem to say. Thanks very much for speaking to us.